This past decade began with a bang as BC hosted the world for the 2010 Vancouver Olympics. Olympic fever gripped Vancouver Island, and despite a lack of snow and a tragic death on the luge run, the Games were a huge success, culminating in Sidney Crosby's overtime goal in the gold medal game.
She was a great kid.
A horrific killing then shook Vancouver Island to its core. The premeditated rape and murder of 18-year-old Kimberly Proctor. Her burned body was found along the Galloping Goose in Langford. She'd been lured there by two classmates and brutally killed.
We have someone down there.
Following the lead of other provinces, BC banned the use of cell phones behind the wheel. Police handed out close to 20,000 fines for texting or talking in the first 6 months alone. In August, a migrant ship was intercepted off the coast of BC. The MV Sunsea was brought to CFB Esquimalt with nearly 500 Sri Lankan Tamils on board, leading to a long asylum process. In 2011, a magnitude 9 earthquake in Japan led to the Fukushima reactor meltdown, triggering a devastating tsunami that sparked warnings for the west coast. Tsunami debris started washing up on our shores in 2012 and can still be found on island beaches. Rioting erupted on the streets of Vancouver in June after the Canucks lost to the Boston Bruins in Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Final. At least 140 people were hurt, and property damage was in the millions. Close to 900 charges were laid. And after a huge public outcry over how the harmonized sales tax was hurting businesses, a referendum on repealing the controversial HST was held. The yes side won, and BC reverted back to the PST-GST model. 2012 saw the start of pipeline protests against both the Northern Gateway pipeline, which was ultimately stopped, and the twinning of Kinder Morgan's Trans Mountain pipeline, which Ottawa would buy for $4.5 billion in 2018. And Belmont grad Ryder Hedgestall rode into the history books at the Giro d'Italia, becoming the first Canadian to win one of cycling's 3 Grand Tour races. Christy Clark was the comeback queen in 2013, leading the Liberals to an even greater majority against Adrian Dix's NDP, and proving all the polls and pundits wrong. A shocking plot to blow up the BC legislature on Canada Day, while thousands celebrated on the lawn, was foiled by police, but charges would eventually be stayed against the couple who planted the bombs after a judge ruled RCMP entrapped them, calling the police investigation a travesty of justice. And in October, after several serious crashes and increasing safety concerns, the first $15 million of Malahat Highway improvements were announced. In 2014, this shocking video of a motorcycle weaving through traffic on the Trans-Canada at speeds approaching 300 kilometers an hour went viral. But Randy Scott was acquitted after prosecutors failed to prove he was the one riding the bike. Tragedy hit Nanaimo in April when a lone gunman opened fire at Western Forest Products' downtown sawmill, killing 2 men and injuring 2 others. Former mill worker Kevin Addison was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. And after months of escalating job action, BC teachers walked off the job in June. The strike continued in September, and after a total of 5 weeks on the picket line, a deal was finally reached. But the contentious issue of class size and composition still had to be worked out in the courts. Deer, cougars, and bears, oh my, in 2015, beginning with Oak Bay's controversial deer cull. The pilot project, the first cull in an urban area in BC, saw 11 deer trapped and killed. Opposition was fierce, and a contraceptive vaccine is now being tried instead. BC Conservation Officer Bryce Cassavant was suspended in July for refusing to kill 2 black bear cubs near Port Hardy. Their mum was put down after repeatedly raiding a freezer full of meat and salmon. The story went viral and made international headlines. It was the warmest summer in 75 years, with almost no rain in Victoria from late April to the end of August, leading to a crisis situation for the Cowichan River and ongoing drought issues in the summer. A wayward cougar ended up in densely populated James Bay in October, leading police and conservation officials on quite the chase.
Holy!
The big cat jumped through backyards before it was finally tranquilized and relocated to the forest. And the Tofino tragedy rocked the West Coast. 6 tourists died when the whale-watching boat Leviathan II capsized at the end of October. Many more would have perished had it not been for the heroic actions of those who rushed to help from the nearby village of Ahousaht. In 2016, tragedy struck again with the death of Constable Sarah Beckett. The West Shore RCMP officer and mother of 2 was killed when a speeding drunk driver slammed into her police cruiser. Kenneth Jacob Fenton was sentenced to 4 years in prison. Victoria Police Chief Frank Elsner was suspended in April. He'd been off the job since December 2015 when the Police Complaint Commissioner launched a misconduct investigation. He'd been exchanging inappropriate messages with the wife of one of his officers. Other investigations would follow as the saga dragged on. Another saga, Victoria's tent city on the courthouse lawn, came to an end in August after a judge ruled it was unsafe and needed to be shut down. Hundreds of units of transitional and permanent housing were created as homelessness and the housing crisis became one of the top issues of the decade.
All those in favor of the motion?
After decades of debate, repeated delays, and $500 million in government grants in jeopardy, the Capital Regional District finally approved a $765 million sewage treatment plant at McLaughlin Point. As the decade ends, it's still under construction.
Go, 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 go.
Construction finally began on the $85 million Mackenzie Overpass in September. Aimed at easing the Colwood Crawl, construction would lead to more commuter chaos, and delays and cost overruns mean it won't be done until the summer of 2020. And we rolled out the royal red carpet in the fall for Prince William and Duchess Kate, who brought Prince George and Princess Charlotte on their first visit to Canada. The family used Victoria as their base for the 8-day visit. 2017 goes down in the history books as a tumultuous time in BC politics. The Liberals won the election just barely, but BC's first minority government in 65 years would fall just a few weeks later.
But Her Honour's present government does not have the confidence of this House.
The NDP take over thanks to an agreement with the Greens, and John Horgan becomes only the second Victoria-born premier in history. Victoria's first protected bike lanes open on May 1st on Pandora, the first phase of a controversial $9 million bike lane initiative that continues to be a polarizing hot-button topic. The body of Nanaimo teen Michaela Chang, missing since March, was found in May after an extensive search. Her murder remains unsolved. And the year ended with the horrific murders of young Chloe and Aubrey Berry on Christmas Day in Oak Bay. The 6-year-old and 4-year-old were repeatedly stabbed to death by their father, Andrew Berry. 2018 begins with one of the worst cases of animal abuse the BCSPCA's ever seen. Teddy the dog was found emaciated and tied up in Duncan, with the collar so embedded in his neck it touched the bone. He couldn't be saved. After years of delays, a ballooning budget, and steel fabrication issues in China, the new Johnson Street Bridge finally opened at the end of March. Amid cheers and jeers, a statue of John A. Macdonald was removed from Victoria City Hall in August as part of First Nations reconciliation. The controversial decision had critics accusing City Council of trying to erase history. For the second summer in a row, raging wildfires engulfed BC, and thick smoke blanketed the West Coast. 2018 would go down as the worst year on record, with more than 1.3 million hectares burned. Under a cloud of uncertainty about the potential health and safety impacts, cannabis was legalized in Canada in October, but BC would lag behind other provinces with just one legal pot shop and ongoing delays in license approvals. December brought the worst windstorm in BC hydro history. It left more than 750,000 people without power and damaged a record amount of hydro infrastructure. 2018 was also the worst year for the opioid crisis, with more than 1,500 fatal overdoses. A public health emergency was first declared in BC in 2016, with the province the hardest hit in the country. The last year of the decade kicks off with an epic snowstorm.
I seen cars spinning out. I seen cars flipping over onto the side.
The winter wallop brought 68 centimeters to the Victoria airport, making it the snowiest February on record. In April, Andrew Barry's murder trial begins in Vancouver, lasting almost 6 months. The Oak Bay father is found guilty of second-degree murder for the brutal killings of little Chloe and Aubrey Barry, but appeals the verdict and his sentence. In May, a massive fire destroys the former Plaza Hotel in downtown Victoria. The blaze at the historic building's deemed suspicious, and the building's caretaker was never found. In June, the trial begins in a decades-old cold case thanks to cutting-edge DNA technology. William Earl Talbot is found guilty in Washington state of the 1987 murders of young Saanich couple Tanya von Kullenberg and Jay Cook. On Canada Day, 3,000 coastal forestry workers walk off the job. The strike drags on all year, leaving families struggling and crippling the economy. The summer brings a massive cross-Canada manhunt for 2 Port Alberni teens who are suspects in 3 northern BC murders. After an intensive search, the bodies of Briar Shemelski and Cam McLeod are eventually found in Manitoba. And climate protests on Vancouver Island and around the world draw tens of thousands of people, many of them students demanding action on climate change.